Hi everyone, this is a video to discuss Mary Oliver's chapter titled Diction, Tone, and Voice. I may have mentioned before, but I will say again, all three essays we'll read from Mary Oliver are from her book called A Poetry Handbook. I think I mentioned that in the title video. And so the book is a guide to, let's say, new writers who are interested in poetry, do understand a bit about poetry but are learning more. So young would-be poets who want to learn more about the craft. So some of the book is informational. It's not necessarily argumentative because she's not writing to an audience who doesn't care about, doesn't like, doesn't understand some of poetry. So she knows that she's writing to an interested audience a lot of the time, and she doesn't need to convince them of anything. So the first two essays that we'll look at, this one, Diction, Tone, and Voice and Imagery, are not argumentative. And I just want to make that clear from the very beginning. So they're not technically full model texts for our final essay, but they do model some key elements that I'd like you to include in your final essay. So we're going to talk about that today. And jump in with diction, tone, and voice to begin. Let's see. So I'll start with this document. We'll just read a few things and then jump over to an actual PDF of the chapter and kind of work through a couple observations I want to make for you and just identifying a couple key elements that this essay shows you. So I'm going to read this kind of introduction first and then we'll go from there. So as I kind of just hinted, this essay does not analyze a poem to show the skill in action or the effect of the skill. And it also doesn't make a persuasive argument. Instead, it gives thorough definitions of what tone is and what the tone of different styles of poetry are, and discusses their effects in a general sense. Now, we're looking at this because this is something you'll do in the definition section of your essay. You're going to define what tone is, and define different tones are, and what their effect is in general. This is, of course, if you are writing about tone and diction. Reading this essay and watching this video is still useful for you because there is a lot of summary and definition of poetry, and that's part of everyone's essay, is that they're making claims about what poetry is, separate from their skill. So still though, the focus of this is diction and tone. And when I hint at this idea of definition section of the essay, this is a new term, but I'm calling it a section. So far, we've only talked about the problem-making section, and then a transition section, and then a solution section. Over here, when I'm talking about definition section, I'm talking about your argument in defense of poetry and in defense of the technical skill. So what would be considered the solution part of the essay? Well, as we're going to see when we get to the sound chapter, when we talk about how Mary Oliver and then Charles Baxter organize and develop their essay, we're going to see that each of them has, at the beginning stages of the solution, extended definition of their topic and sequence of definitions, really. We also saw that with Kenneth Koch in The Language of Poetry. He starts the language of poetry with a number of definitions about what poetic sound is, what poetry is, just defining. So we're going to call it now a definition section where you're developing that definition of your topic. One way that we've looked at before with Kenneth Koch in particular is a writer using metaphors as a primary mode of definition. They're trying to define this abstract idea or concept or term to their audience, and they've chosen to do it through metaphor, or at times choose to do it through metaphor. And Diction, Tone, and Voice chapter does a good job of using metaphors to define tone, but also to define poetry. And we're going to look at these pages. Let's see, we've noted 6 of them here. Some of these pages have multiple, where Mary Oliver is using metaphor to define. You might also want to consider, I'm not going to do this in this video, but this is something you can do on your own, that in a way there is a hint at a problem-making section in this chapter. Now, I just said that this isn't a persuasive essay per se. She doesn't identify a specific audience and problem, but there's almost a kind of an indirect problem-making section related to diction and tone in the section called inappropriate language. It's more like what Mary Oliver is doing is warning her readers not to use this kind of language, but you can imagine easily being able to turn this into a problem-making section that people who don't understand poetry or people who are first writing poetry use inappropriate language when it comes to diction choice and tone. So it's kind of a hint at a problem-making section that you might be able to get some ideas about, specifically if you're writing about tone, but also maybe if you're writing about poetry in general. So I'm going to get off this and let's look at the metaphors first, and then I'm going to come back to a couple key ideas a little bit later on. So let's see. I'm going to keep this up on the screen, and I'm also going to pull up Mary Oliver. So let's just look at the metaphors and identify them, and then again, these are here so you can see how not only a writer uses metaphor to define, but to even generate some ideas in you about what kind of metaphors you could create to define your topic, your technical skill, and to define poetry as well early on in your solution section. So the first one we see is on 77. The first metaphor we get is here at the bottom of the page. She's talking about the tone of a contemporary poem. And she says, they are not unlike letters you might have received from a good friend. They have that tone of intimacy. So that's our first metaphor. She's trying to describe what the tone of contemporary poetry is in general. She's not talking about a specific poem, but overall, they do have this tone of intimacy, like someone's talking to you. We know that from Philip Levine's Coming Close. We know that from what other poems have a particular appeal to that? I guess the other Levine poem, Fear and Fame, also with Try to Praise the Mutilated World. We see this kind of, seems like a friend's talking to you, an intimate tone, you're being spoken to. Anyway, that's the first metaphor. We have another one on 80. So let's go to that. Comes in the middle of the page here. It says, and the finest of these poems brim from the particular, the regional, the personal, and become, so by brim from the particular, she's saying they come from specific experience of a person or a place or a community of people. So they're developed out of that. She says, and become, as all successful poems must, parables that say something finally about our own lives as well as the lives of the author. So she's talking about poetry here more than tone necessarily, but it is a little bit of a blend. But a nice metaphor again. Now, some of you might be asking, what's a parable? You could look that up to find out a little bit more, but it is a metaphor. She's comparing poems to parables here. She has 85 and then 87. Okay, so at the top of 85, so it kind of starts at the bottom of 84 and then moves over. She's talking about the lyric poem, and she's saying this is the most popular poem that we see in contemporary poetry. It's a poem that's brief, it's less than 60 lines. She says the lyric poem is brief, concentrated, has usually no more than a single subject and focus, and no more than a single voice, and is more likely to employ a simple and natural rather than an intricate and composed musicality. So she's basically saying what we've seen in all of the poems we've read so far for the class. They have a single story or a single kind of scene that's being developed. Um, they are from the first person and sometimes the second person point of view, but it is a single voice. And they don't rhyme, other than William Butler Yeats' Like Alvin is Free. They don't have kind of a rhyming pattern or rhythmic pattern. Again, that goes back to the conversational aspect of them. But then she says, the lyric poem is not unlike a simple coiled spring waiting to release its energy in a few clear phrases. So again, this is how a type of poem is working, but also how the tone of a type of poem is working, that kind of feeling that it's a spring waiting to be released, and releasing its energy. It has this power to it that adds to its tone. She repeats that idea of the tightly coiled spring again. But later on 87, when she's talking about poetic diction, and this is in the inappropriate language section, she says, the actual forming of the world of the poem in the imagination can't happen when poetic diction is used because the words or images are simply out of electricity. By poetic diction, she means almost long, kind of old-standing, cliche language that used to show up in poems hundreds of years ago and just aren't suitable for a contemporary audience. They've been used. They don't have that power, that what she has said about the spring releasing its energy. They don't have that same effect because they've been overused, and that's what cliche really is. One more page, I think. We have two more pages, 89, talking about informational language. She says, informational language, or informational words, do not ever desire to throw two shadows. And we know that there's some room for interpretation in poetry. There's some room to understand multiple meanings of words and how they both make us think logically, but then also make us feel a particular way. Mary Oliver's Life is Chicken Soup. Chicken soup gives us an image, but it also makes us feel, and it also makes us think about the scene in which that takes place. So it's throwing two shadows. She's saying informational language doesn't do this. The words mean one thing, and they're very direct and simple. So we're just looking at, again, another metaphor, though. And then lastly, on 90, she says, in a section called appropriate language, talking about syntax, but really talking about word choice here. She says every adjective and adverb is worth 5 cents. Every verb is worth 50 cents. And we talked about that in the very beginning of the quarter when we did our tone and diction style portfolio practice, that the verbs carry so much more meaning and tone than adjectives do. Don't say happy when you can describe an action and use a descriptive verb that would reveal joy or happiness, so on and so forth. So that's a nice collection of metaphors that are sometimes defining tone and sometimes defining poetry. And these are just there for you to kind of inspire you, to show you that you also can come up with your own metaphors as you try to define your technical skill and also define poetry to your audience. We know that we use metaphors when we're describing an abstract idea or an unfamiliar idea to our audience. And they are definitely unfamiliar with poetry, as your problem making should be establishing. And also it's an abstract, kind of distant, unfamiliar thing to them. So metaphor is going to work to your benefit here in this definition section. The last thing is looking at these quotes. I pulled these quotes because I just thought they were interesting talking points. They're not going to necessarily add anything to this idea of definition, but they'll help me make a few points that I've highlighted here about poetry in general and also tone. So on page 77, she's kind of giving the history a little bit. She's kind of giving a scope of what poetry has been like and how it's developed. And then she says the body of poetry from which American poetry developed carried with it a sense of formality, of difference from the ordinary world. So this is English poetry in particular, and then early American poetry, very formal. And then she goes on to say much of contemporary poetry is written in a diction that almost belies that it was formally composed, meaning someone was sitting there and making choices about how this thing and its musicality and its sound should develop. It seems like someone's talking to you, but there is a craft or an art behind it. She says its general tone is one of natural and friendly intimacy. The language is not noticeably different from ordinary language. And this tone of intimacy, of course, doesn't just happen. It happened because the writer intended it to happen. Now, part of this idea of this general tone, natural friendly intimacy, this letters to a friend, this might help you in one way or another talk about poetry and how readable it actually is to your audience. How you can give them this picture that it's not as academic and proper and stuffy as they might think, but that it actually has this different tone. That might show up when you're defining and talking about poetry in general to your audience. One other thing that I highlighted here was this idea of intended. Just pointing out the fact that these technical skills that are being used, whether it's tone or imagery or sound, were carefully chosen by the writer to have a particular effect. So a tone of intimacy doesn't just happen naturally, it's crafted. And when we analyze, what we're doing is looking to make an argument about the choices the writer made to intend a certain effect. She also says that the poet has moved from the role of professor to the role of fellow citizen, neighbor, and friend. A perfectly knowable person behind the poem. Again, this kind of maybe would help you talk about maybe the tone of the poem, but just poetry in general and what your audience could expect of it. And then this quote we already saw, the finest of these poems brim from the particular, the regional, the personal, and become as all successful poems must parables that say something finally about our own lives. I don't know, I highlighted this. You're going to see more claims like this, or statements like this, in the imagery chapter, which is the next video in the modules. But this is kind of saying something about the value or purpose or effect of poetry. So again, this might help you kind of talk about poetry. This is that part of the essay that's defending poetry. That is, again, we'll talk about where that happens in the sound essay and the Charles Baxter essay, but we do know that that's one of your purposes, to defend poetry, and you need to be able to talk about it, give metaphors for it, define it, talk about what its benefits are throughout the process. So that's it for this video. I'll come back. Read Mary Oliver's chapter again and pay attention to language that you enjoy, the way she describes not just poetry, but also tone. Not just the metaphors, but other ways. Maybe certain examples stick out to you. You're just trying to pay attention to how people talk about poetry, not only so you can kind of be inspired to talk about it yourself, but maybe because there's a quote in there, there's a passage in there that you feel you might be able to use in your essay. As we know, that is one of the requirements of the final paper, is to include quotes from the essays we've read to support your claims. So I'll be back in the next video with imagery. Until then, see you soon.